Hello, today I'm going to be setting up my expansion palette and we're going to be talking about paints, which is one of my favourite things to talk about. I went over this palette and its features in a kind of first impressions video recently, so if you're interested in knowing more about the palette itself, there's all of that information in that video. But today I'm actually going to be setting it up and talking about what an expansion palette is, how I'm planning on using it in my practice. I'm also going to show you how I rehome old paint, which is why there's some full pans and half pans on the palette here, because I'm going to be moving the paint from those into here. So I'm going to show you how I do that, but I'm also going to be pouring paint out as well. And I'll go over the colours I'm using and everything like that in this video. To start off with, I want to just mention that expansion palettes are not something new. They tend to show up in quite a few different practices, different artists' preferences and things like that, but they're not, they go by different names and things like that. But the first time I heard the term expansion palette was from the artist Victoria, and I'll leave all of her information in the description. I love the term expansion palette, and I've jokingly referred to this palette as my non-DLC palette, so non-downloadable palette, because it just makes me think of like expansion packs in video games. So I really love this term, and I just want to give credit where credit is due because it is not a term that I came up with. But the idea of an expansion palette, again, it differs from artist to artist. So for me, what I want from this palette is I want a place for all of the paints that I love, but I don't use frequently enough to be on my main palette. So it's a lot of paints that I use for particular circumstances, for special effects, or they have qualities that I only sometimes need. So there's going to be a mixture of different paints in here that have various different properties. Some are staining, some are granulating, some are opaque, some are transparent. And the vast majority are going to be special effect paints. So these are going to be very heavily granulating paints, or for me, opaque paints are a special effect paint because I only use them in very particular circumstances. But there are also some paints that you would, if you know me and my painting preferences, you would maybe expect them to be on my main palette, but they're not. And that is the case with some of the paints you can see laying out here. So what shall we start with first? Let's talk about how I'm reusing paint first, and then I'll go over the actual paints that I'm putting in. So you saw me take paint out of full pans, and now I'm going to be sticking them into their new homes. And I found that the easiest way to do this is by putting water onto where I want to stick them and then pressing the paint down onto that water. And I found the easiest way to do that is with a palette knife. It's the least messy solution, but this method of removing and sticking down paint I've found is only really possible with paint that sets like this. It's best for a paint that doesn't set too crumbly, but also sets enough that it's not sticky. That's the kind of paint that you can do this process with. And thankfully, all of the paints that I'm putting into this palette have set like that. There are certain brands that tend to use honey, and those are very, very sticky. You're going to be able to move them quite easily without having to stick them down because they are so sticky, but it is a very messy process. And it's not ideal. It's not ideal for moving paint, but it works. Thankfully though, it's relatively mess-free this time. The actual paint that you're seeing me use though is from the Daniel Smith Essentials set, or at least the full pan sizes are. The half pan is a different one that I'll go over. The Essentials Split Primary set is the first set of professional watercolors I ever picked up. When I first started learning to paint, I used student grade paint for a while, and then I slowly got into professional paint, first with a split primary palette, and then started gathering some more paints. I also had 1 or 2 Sennelier tubes, and I can't remember if I picked those up first or after this, but the first set I ever picked up was this. The set contains 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues, and each one has a warm colour and a cool colour, and that's the whole premise of a split primary palette. So for the yellows, we have Hansa Yellow Light and then New Gamboge. For the reds, there is Pyrrole Scarlet and Quinacridone Rose, and for the blues, there's French Ultramarine and Phthalo Blue Green shade. And I'm only including 5 of the paints in this. I'm not including the French Ultramarine, though that is going to appear later on in a different version later on in this palette. But for now, I'm just including the 5 other paints. And starting with the yellows, I did have to clean the 2 yellows a little bit before I ended up filling them in with the rest of the paint. I didn't fully fill every paint that I put in here, but I did use up all of the rest of my Hansa Yellow Light just to get the tube done. So that's all of my remaining Hansa Yellow Light in this pan. I didn't use all of the New Gamboge. I didn't use all of the Quinacridone Rose. I did use up the Pyrrole Scarlet, I believe, and I did use up the Phthalo Blue Green shade. The Pyrrole Scarlet and the Phthalo Blue Green shade I had the least of going into this. I used them the most out of the split primary set. The yellows I had quite a lot of because I ended up falling in love with other yellows over time, especially PY 150, which is Nicolazzo yellow. That is on my main palette, and I use it in place of having a split primary yellow most of the time. But I have been enjoying Azo Orange on my main palette for a little bit now as a kind of warm yellow substitute. These are all going in my palette for a few different reasons. One is that they're colours that I love the hue of them, I love how they mix. They also have characteristics that I really like in line and colour illustration. Most of my main palette is designed for my line and colour illustrations where I do line art and then watercolour on top. So the vast majority of them are transparent or semi-transparent, and both yellows and the rose are transparent, but the Pyrrole Scarlet is semi-transparent, but I'd probably say semi-opaque. It's definitely starting to be more semi-opaque. It works with line and colour illustration enough for me, but I do really, really love the hue of it. And of course, Phthalos are very transparent, so of course that one is a love for me when it comes to line and colour illustration. Next up, we have Quinacridone Burnt Scarlet, which is a pigment that I picked up for fun, out of curiosity a while back, and it's now discontinued. I believe you can still get it still, but it is discontinued, and I'm not going to probably pick it up again after I finish this, but I do want to use it while I still have it. So this is going in the palette. It's a really pretty hue. It's not a necessity for me, hence why it's not on my main palette, but it is a really pretty hue and it's also transparent. So again, very useful for my line and colour illustrations. Then we have Permanent Red Deep by Mission Gold. This is kind of a middle red. I picked it up to test out and see if it could be a not Phthalo, I keep saying Phthalo instead of Pyrrole, a Pyrrole Scarlet replacement for me that's a bit cheaper, but it does have more of a middle rather than a warm hue. But I do still find it useful and I do want to use it. I don't just want it sat in my watercolour box gaining dust. So that is also coming on this palette. Now we have French Ultramarine by Schminke, and there was a little bit of a splitting problem at the start here, but it's easy enough to fix before I pour it out. Schminke's French Ultramarine is by far the most granulating ultramarine, and I would probably say granulating paint I have ever used. And I use it as a special effect paint and a special effect ultramarine. My main palette has an ultramarine on it, which is my everyday ultramarine, and that is by Sennelier. Sennelier's ultramarine barely granulates. It granulates, but it's a very soft granulation, and because it's so soft, it can be applied in more ways and in more subjects and cases than a very heavily granulating pigment can. So I like having the option of both, and having a place to now have my Special Effect Ultramarine is very good in my practice. You may also see it pop up in a video soon, just as a little teaser, a little spoiler. The next paint that I am putting in here is Cobalt Turquoise. It is on the more opaque end. Gorgeous hue. I picked it up as part of my experimenting and learning phase. Love the hue, but again, because it's more opaque, I generally reach for it only in special circumstances. But because I love the hue so much, it's going in here, and I will definitely use it in certain applications. Now you're seeing me pick out a few different colours, and I'm just trying to decide where I want to put them. So we have Perylene Maroon, or as it's actually termed in this, Maroon Perylene by M. Graham, and we have Terra Rosa by M. Graham. These are starting to get more towards your earthy colours. I would class Perylene Maroon to me is more of an earthy colour. Perylene Maroon is a very reddish hue, but it's usually transparent. It's quite saturated when it is wet, and then it becomes a lot more muted as it dries. So that's why I view it as an earthy colour, and I generally put it with my red earths. It is a lovely hue to work with, but I don't find it a necessity. But again, because of its transparency, I do find it useful in my line and colour illustrations on occasion. So that's why it's coming in this palette. Terra Rosa, however, which is more of, again, that sort of reddish earth tone, is a very, very opaque pigment, and I absolutely adore Terra Rosa. I love its hue, I love how it granulates, I especially love how it mixes with blues. Terra Rosa and Ultramarine together is absolutely gorgeous, but because it's opaque, I only ever reach for it when I'm not doing line and colour illustrations, and because I do those less often, it doesn't go on my main palette, but I absolutely love this paint. So it's definitely going in the expansion palette. In a moment as well, I'll be adding the last two pigments for now, which is Neutral Tint by M. Graham, which is a lovely, very purple neutral, and it doesn't have any black in its mix. I don't tend to use this as a way of modifying other colours. I like to use it mainly on its own, and I adjust it with its components, which is pink and a green. I especially love it for monochromatic painting. And then we have Luna Black, and Luna Black is by Daniel Smith. This is a special effect paint because it is very, very granulating, and it is a black pigment, so I don't reach for it that often. It would only be for very specific special effects that I would reach for it, but it is a very unique pigment to have around. So there's a little summary of each paint and why it's important in my practice. Enough that I would put it on an expansion palette, but not enough that it would go on my main palette. I'm going to be taking this palette and doing a painting with it, which should be next week's video, rather than doing swatching, because I'd like to share this palette in action, because I feel like in action you get to understand the paints a lot more than just by swatching. To answer a question that I got last time, I am not making this palette into my main palette because I'm already happy with the characteristics of my main palette. I don't need exchangeable wells on my main palette because I don't change out the colours as often as something like this, and the size fits me better. My main palette is slightly smaller than this, so it fits a hybrid role of being able to be used in the studio and also being taken outside, whereas this is starting to get a little bit too big for what I like to take around with me. So I hope that that answers questions that other people might have as well. If you do have any other questions though, please leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!